Okay, the most important thing that we need to know about these groups that we're going to talk about in this course, the Celts, the Romans, and the various peoples uh, putting under the heading the Northmen and the Germans, is that these are not races. For most of professional historian existence, these groups have been thought of almost as sort of a race, a pure group that had sort of genetic similarities. And not only do those things pretty much not exist anyway in history, but these groups that we're going to talk about, they don't, you wouldn't look on the genetic level and find that they're the same. What we can say about these groups sometimes, and when we're talking about the Celts, for example, is that we can say that they have certain linguistic things in common and probably some cultural habits. So there's some ethnicity commonality that we can talk about. But it's important that we not think of these as like unified groups. All of the groups that we're talking about are coming into contact with, or coming into formation as they move through time and place and are defined by people who have writing that we can read. So the Celts and the various peoples we call the Germans or the Northmen or the Anglo-Saxons, they have certain religious practices and linguistic things in common, but we don't read. They don't leave us their record of their thoughts about themselves, their self-identity, and so we end up having to trust what the Greeks or the Romans are saying about them, or later what Christians are saying about them. And the Christians or the Romans or the Greeks, they don't necessarily know that much about the people they're coming into contact with. And so a lot of times it's like if you had to go back if you went forward a couple hundred years in history and you're trying to find out what the United States was, but all you could use was the records of the people that we invaded in the 20th century. So the Iraqis and the Afghanistans were the only people, let's say, that could the records would survive about us. And then you try to come up with who are the Americans, but through that lens, you'd have a very limited perspective. So that we're doing the same thing when we're going to the past. That's the most important thing. And the second most important thing is when we're talking about the Romans or the Celts or the Anglo-Saxons or the Vikings or any of these people, they're really all one of the same, part of the same group. And we call this group the Indo-European language family. Genetically, humans, we all come from the same root, right? But the linguistic development, the development of languages through history, goes into a couple major categories, and one of them is this category we call the Indo-European tree. I'll come back to this in a second, but just to start with the European part of it. So the Indo-European groups of peoples are groups that are moving from probably Central Asia down into India and at the same time down into Europe, and they're splitting off from each other. And the time period of this splitting is probably something like 1500 BC or something like that. So imagine that these two roots of the tree are splitting apart from each other around 1500 BC. So then the groups that are going into India are going to become the Indo-Aryans, and they're going to develop the languages and the cultures of modern India, including the religion of Hinduism, right? There were people there before them, but they're going to come and replace those people. And the same group of people, this Indo-European family that splits around 1500, are also going to grow, you see the right branch of this tree, into Europe and develop all of these languages. So today, almost half of all people with a first language in the world speak an Indo-European language, 46%, something like that. The sort of traditional view is that this group who speaks this proto-language called Indo-European, let's say, they start from the steppes of Central Asia, let's say the sort of this area here, and they move down into Iran and India and down into Europe. Let's say they split around 1500 BC. So it's in these Indo-European languages that sort of emerge in Europe that we're going to find most of the things that we're interested in this brief course in terms of the groups of people and linguistic history and the political history that Tolkien is going to draw on for his mythology. As you can see in all of these, sort of the brown color here, you have Germanic languages, right? These are Romance languages. And then you see this little fringe here. It's sometimes called the Celtic fringe, where you have these Celtic language groups. You can see this little tiny region of France. This is called Brittany. You can see this region here in the British Isles. That's called Wales. And you could also sometimes find, at least you could for a long time, you could find Celtic languages being spoken in this little stretch of England here. It's called Cornwall. And they spoke a language called Cornish, although that's largely disappeared. You could find it in northern Scotland, and you can find it in Ireland. And you can still find it today in Ireland in what we call Gaelic, right? And in Welsh today, which is still broadly spoken. You'll see it on street signs and everything when we're in Wales. So those are Celtic languages here. They're part of this broader family, right? And the Romance languages, of course, are these Celtic influences and this Germanic influence mixed with the Latin that's coming from the Roman Empire, right? And that's turning into French and Spanish and I think Italian and things like that. We speak English, which is a Germanic language. Okay, so more specifically, let's talk about this group we call the Celts first. You're going to find a lot of different names that we classify, at least linguistically, as the groups we're calling the Celts. In France, they're often called the Gauls. When Julius Caesar is interacting with those people in France, he calls them the Gauls. In England, you'll find the Romans call these people the Bretons. You'll find them called the Gaels, the Scotti, and the Picts. Those are people in Ireland and Scotland, right? And there's some Gauls in Spain as well. And of course, some of them end up going into Turkey, although you can't see it really on this map, what we would call Turkey today, and become a group of people called the Galatians. That's also a Celtic group. And of course, the Apostle Paul is going to write a letter to them after they convert to Christianity. Well, okay, so let's talk. We have a group we're calling the Celts here, and for convenience, and they're a little bit hard to define, and they speak a group of related languages. Okay, but what do we know about them? Well, this is sort of controversial. There have been people in where we are today in Oxford, in England. There have been people here for a very, very long time. And things that they've left behind that are thousands and thousands of years old that we're familiar with, like menhir standing stones like this one, or this is called a dolmen, right, with a large rock on top of these standing stones here, or henges, right, and this is a reconstruction of something called Woodhenge, which is just a site just a couple of miles away from Stonehenge. The more famous Stonehenge, but this is a reconstruction of what it might look like 2500 BC, right? So like thousands and thousands of years ago. This is a much more impressive site if you can imagine it like this. There's lots of stone circles around the world. This one's in Spain, and then of course the famous Stonehenge, which is in Salisbury Plain in England, which is maybe these largest stones. So some of the smaller stones come from Wales, and they're probably older than 3000 BC, older than the pyramids. These larger stones don't come from so far away, we think now, and they're probably maybe 2500 BC at the earliest, but that's still very, very early, right? You can find very close to us, if you're in Oxford today, you can find things like these chalk hill figures as well. This is called the Uffington White Horse, and that's been around probably for a very long time, maybe 1500 BC, something like that. Okay. Who made this stuff? Well, you're still going to find people arguing about this. Maybe it's the same people we call the Celts. Maybe they were already here. But the traditional view is that the Celts are people who came from Central Europe and they moved into all of these areas, starting from, let's say, 800 BC and, going through the next several centuries. Here's the Galatians. Here's the Eastern Celts, right? And the Romans, we'll talk about in a second, the Romans start running into these people around 400, 300 BC, something like that. The Gauls are the Celts as well, right? They start taking over France in this time period, and then all of this area of England. So in this traditional view, let's take another version of this. Here's another version of the traditional view. This comes from my recently acquired book from the British Museum about the Celts. This is the traditional view. They start here, and then they sort of move into these other areas after, let's say, 800 BC. Here's another version of the traditional view. Okay, but lately, things have been changing in the scholarly opinion a little bit. Here's an alternative idea, that the original Celts are these people that live in this area that we still find Celtic languages spoken, or at least remaining here today, and moved in this direction. So in this view, the Celts are the people who built Stonehenge, and they built this white chalk sculpture and stuff like that. They didn't enter these places; they were there from very early on. I mention all of this because this is something that Tolkien was very interested in, and Tolkien was about 50 years or 40 years earlier than most of the scholarship in making an argument that the Celts are not a very easily definable cultural group. This is the way he put it. Quote, anything is possible in the fabulous Celtic twilight, which is not so much a twilight of the gods as of the reason. In other words, you can make up anything and put it under this heading, because this is not a place where we're using logic. It's a place where we group all kinds of other things. I'm recording this today after we visited Holywell Cemetery this morning, a place in which you saw tons of Celtic crosses. And of course, I'm talking about a period in the beginning here where there are no Christians yet. But this sort of, these designs, these sort of circular twisting designs, like this kind of stuff, you'll find in a lot of art that we talk about as Celtic. What else do we know about them? Well, as a group, we're already going to enter now the reign of stereotypes, the region of stereotypes, because now we're going to start having to rely on the Greeks and the Romans to talk about these people that don't identify, that are other to them. So here is a Greek geographer named Strabo, who's writing about this group of people he calls the Celts, right? Quote, the whole race is war-mad, high-spirited, quick to battle, but otherwise straightforward and not of evil character. And so when they are stirred up, they assemble in their bands for battle quite openly and without forethought. They are ready to face danger even if they have nothing on their side but their own strength and courage. End quote. You'll find many discussions of their drunkenness and their obsession with wine drinking. So here is a Roman named Diodorus Siculus. He writes of the Gauls, the Celts in Gaul, in France, what we call for today France. Quote, they are exceedingly fond of wine and sate themselves with unmixed wine imported by merchants. Their desire makes them drink it greedily, and when they become drunk, they fall into a stupor or into a maniacal disposition. It's clear from archaeology that there was a lot of, you can find these wine amphorae, these jugs all over Gaul and everything. But of course the Romans and the Greeks, they love their wine too, so it's hard to tell if we should take this too seriously. The Greeks and the Romans mostly identified these groups of people as they were encountering them violently, and they thought of them as barbarians. And barbarians, the word barbarian just means people who say barbara, which means their language is unintelligible to me. It's basically the Greeks and the Romans saying they talk funny. And we also associate, besides the sort of patterns of art that I've discussed, we also associate the Celts with a religion in which the most prominent practitioners are the Druids. And the Druids were a real group of elites. They weren't just priests, magicians, but they were also maybe bards and storytellers. They were the cultural sort of officials of whatever groups of people that we're talking about here. After about, let's say, 800 BC, we know these people, whatever relationship they have to each other, certainly a linguistic one, they speak a set of languages that are clearly connected. We can look in the archaeological record and we can find similar objects in their graves. We know that there are certain religious beliefs, mythological beliefs, and stories that are shared because they take different forms as people go in different places. But what we know for sure is that they're running into the Romans here. They're running into the people in Spain in the 500s. They're running into people in Greece in the 200s here. So we know that these people are on the move, regardless of what else we can say about them. And it's a warrior culture. They're still using chariots. They have bronze goods. I'll tell you about this wonderful cartoon called Asterix and Obelix. You'll reflect on that in a little bit. There have been various reconstructions of the costume and the sort of the battle wear of these groups of people. But the best things, the sort of most accurate information we have about a few figures really comes in interaction with the Romans. And I'm going to tell you about two figures that we know a little bit about in the 1st century AD, and then I'm going to go back and tell you about the first people the Romans tell us, the first person and groups of Celts that the Romans tell us about it. One, you can find this statue in London if you look hard, and if you do, please, if you find it, tell me about it. But this is a statue of Boudica. And Boudica is someone we know as the Queen of the Iceni now. And the Queen, and this is a group of people that are sometimes called the Britons. And I'll show you where they are on a map here. It's usually they're somewhere over here in what we would say is eastern England today. And they take advantage of a moment in which a Roman detachment who is occupying England is fighting over in Wales to launch a rebellion. And here's how Tacitus, the Roman historian, describes what happens. Boudica, according to my very short introduction on the Celts, purchased from Blackwell's bookstore, was the wife of Prasutagus, the king of the Iceni, a tribe occupying much of East Anglia at the time of the Roman invasion of Britain in AD 43. After upsetting the Romans because after the king died, he willed his kingdom not to the Romans but to his daughter and the emperor of Rome, they were punished. Quote, "This was unacceptable to the authorities, and in a confrontation it is claimed that his wife Boudica was beaten and their daughters were raped. This sparked a rebellion, with Boudica assuming the role of war leader. She chose her moment well. When the governor Paulinus was campaigning in northwest Wales, much of the southeast of Britain joined the revolt. The places that didn't join the revolt included London, which is a Roman city, and St. Albans, which cities Boudica attacked, and their populations were killed and the cities were burned. Eventually, the Roman army, quote, confronted the rebel force in battle. Boudica still fought in the old way, with charioteers to the fore and women on baggage trains watching from behind. But the Romans won a resounding victory, after which Boudica committed suicide by taking poison." Here's the story of Caradicus, the king of the Britons, circa 10 to 50 AD, so a contemporary of Boudica's. Caradicus is famous as a rebel against Roman domination of the British Isles. He is eventually loses in a set piece battle and then is captured. Ultimately, he's handed over by someone who wants to make the Romans happy, and is made famous by Tacitus, again, a Roman source, all of these are Roman sources, who has him making a big speech. He's brought home to Rome to presumably be marched in a triumph. That's a big victory parade the Romans would do when they had a military victory. It was a big honor for the general who received the triumph. And it was also an opportunity for basically a political campaign ad where the general would distribute, sort of food and all of the sort of goods that were won in the victory. So Caradicus is brought back to Rome, and Tacitus has him giving a speech in front of the Senate. Tacitus also tells us about a Caledonian named Calgacus. You can see this is the furthest extent of the Roman Empire in pink here, and this would be the line that really sort of almost represents the line between England and Scotland today. Calgacus was a Caledonian, someone from essentially what we call today Scotland, and he's also fighting against the Romans, and Tacitus has him making this speech. They make a desert and call it peace. The Romans were most obsessed with an event that happened much earlier than those accounts, though, and that was the Gaulish sack of Rome in maybe between 390 and 387 BC. So a group of Celts, the Gauls, came over the Alps and marched on Rome. And after they had been upset by Roman diplomats' behavior or something like that, they actually laid siege to Rome. And this takes about 7 months. And there's some amazing stories that come from this particular moment. They were supposedly led by a captain named Brennus. This is a modern sculpture of Brennus. And when the Gauls defeated the Romans in battle and began to lay siege to the city, which was at this point, starting being laid out on 7 hills, but not in between marshlands. It wasn't very populated. And when the Gauls entered the city, all of the most important religious and political officials, they put on all of their finery and the positions of their office and their sort of medals and everything. They just sat in their front yards like statues, according to some of the sources. And the Gauls march in, and for a while they just kind of look at these people, and they think that they look sort of like gods or something because they have all this gold on them. But eventually one of the Gauls goes up and starts stroking one of the Roman senators' beards, and the senator hits this guy on the head with a staff, and then things go nuts, and there's slaughter everywhere. And they kill most of the people in the city except for on one hill. It's called the Capitoline Hill, which is the center, in some ways, where the city of Rome began. And There they lay siege around this hill for many months, while both sides are starving to death and dying of disease. And at one point, the Gauls try to climb up the back of this hill in the middle of the night to surprise them. But the temple of Juno, and that's the same as Hera, the queen of the Olympian pantheon, Zeus's wife or Jupiter's wife. The temple of Juno is up here, and there's a bunch of sacred geese to Juno, and they began squawking as the Gauls try to get up the back of the hill, and so they're warned, and they are able to fight off this attack in the middle of the night. Eventually, the Romans have to pay the Gauls off. And there's a price agreed upon where Brennus says the Romans have to pay the Gauls 1,000 pounds of gold. The Romans agree to this. They bring them out to the scales, but the Gauls cheat and they use sort of weighted scales so that they are demanding more than 1,000 pounds of gold. And the Romans protest this cheating, and Brennus says "Vae victis," and throws his sword onto the scales, so the Romans have to put even more gold there. And "Vae victis" means woe to the conquered. And Brennus is saying, it's not going to be fair. You guys lost. You have to do whatever we say. We have power. The Romans are going to react to this event with this centuries-long attitude of we have to conquer everyone around us to get rid of the threat to our survival. And indeed, from this point on, the Roman Empire will grow in a very dramatic fashion. AD. And of course, this is by this point, by the time it spreads to Britain, that's when you hear those speeches of those famous British rebels like Boudicca and Calgacus and Caraticus. Today, if you look at this map, you're looking with England, Wales, and Scotland at 3 separate countries, although the history is fairly recent that this is the case. If you look at the entire group of landmasses in front of you, these islands off the north coast of Europe in the North Atlantic Ocean, you could use the geographic expression the British Isles to refer to all of these areas. If you just want to refer to the island that includes Scotland, Wales, and England, as it is a continuous island, you might use the term Great Britain. Those 3 countries compose Great Britain. If you discuss the United Kingdom, you're talking about Great Britain, England, Scotland, and Wales, and Northern Ireland. And finally, there's the rest of Ireland. The Republic of Ireland is its own country, and all of those things together are the British Isles.